So this is a video I've been wanting to make ever since my first video essay on the Rankin Bass release of The Hobbit. Since then, I have released videos on both Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings and Rankin Bass' second Middle-earth film, The Return of the King. However, many seem confused about how these films all fit together. What is the chronological order? Are they all canon? Do they tell a congruent and continuous story? These are all questions I've read in my comments section, and I hope to answer them all in this video as we explain the animated Middle-earth movies. Our adventure begins in 1977 with the release of Rankin Bass's adaptation of The Hobbit, which was of course written by English author J.R.R. Tolkien. Rankin Bass Animated Entertainment was an American production company known primarily for their seasonal television specials such as Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and The Little Drummer Boy. Rankin Bass traditionally animated films were often edited by Japanese companies, and The Hobbit was no different. Being animated by Topcraft, a precursor to Studio Ghibli, while Topcraft produced the animation overseas, the concept artwork was completed at the Rankin Bass studio in New York under the direction of Arthur Rankin. The film was produced and directed by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass and was adapted for screen by Romeo Muller, who had worked on several other Rankin Bass productions. Sticking to the source material written by J.R.R. Tolkien was incredibly important to the team. Rankin loved the Tolkien works and decided that not a single thing was to be added to the story. Jules Bass primarily adapted Tolkien's original lyrics for the film's musical interludes, drawn primarily from the songs that feature prominently in the novel. Maury Law was called in to assist with the composition of the film's one original soundtrack, The Greatest Adventure, The Ballad of the Hobbit. The song was sung by Glenn Warbrough and reprised it for the film's sequel, The Return of the King. But we will get to that soon enough. If there is one thing you take away from the video, please let it be this. Listen to this soundtrack. It is amazing and easily one of my favorite movie soundtracks of all time. The film itself, of course, follows the titular Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, as he is recruited by a band of dwarves and travels across Middle-earth. The movie captures the wonder and magic of the original novel, and the most noticeable departures to the story was the compression of some scenes and the complete removal of others due to the time limitations of a television feature. The adventure's hero Bilbo Baggins is voiced by Orson Bean and is accompanied by noted Hollywood director and actor John Huston as the voice of Gandalf. The animated movie was received with mixed reviews, surprisingly, the biggest point of contention being the animation. Reviewers and critics alike both praised and criticized it. Some reviewers regard it as a strong point of the film and praised Topcraft's unique designs. But that is in turn what many reviewers didn't like, the drastic departure in designs. From Gollum's frog-like appearance, green-skinned and grotesque wood elves, and incredibly hairy Smaug all became reasons to dislike the film. Even something as simple as Gandalf's hat being traded for a hood was seen as nonsensical. These points continue to divide fans to this day. I, for one, loved the new and unique designs and continually praised them in my original Hobbit video, but I do understand the annoyance of having an adaptation make such drastic changes to the appearance of beloved characters. But the arguments between critics did not end there. The story and plot continued further arguments and infighting in the community. Tolkien scholar Douglas A. Anderson described the film as execrable, which I had to Google, and it means extremely bad or unpleasant. A few critics said that it was confusing for those not already familiar with the plot, whereas some Tolkien fans questioned the appropriateness of repacking the material as a family film for a very young audience. Many other critics praised the film's ability to adapt the story into a TV movie and enjoyed its simple yet effective take on the novel. In 1978, Romeo Muller won a Peabody Award for his teleplay for The Hobbit. The film was also nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, but lost to Star Wars. Before The Hobbit aired on NBC, Rankin Bass and his partner animation houses were preparing a sequel, but something else was appearing on the horizon. In 1978, Ralph Bakshi released his adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's classic, The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings has been stated to be a book series that would be impossible to adapt to screen. But even since 1969, a potential movie had been in development. An infamous dropped draft of the film was set to cast the Beatles in prominent roles. Even directors David Lean and Stanley Kubrick were approached to direct the film. The latter said that an adaptation would be unfilmable. In 1975, Bakshi convinced United Artists to produce The Lord of the Rings as 2 or 3 animated films, as well as a Hobbit prequel. Work began on scripts and storyboards, but a series of conflicts, drama, and firings resulted in Bakshi developing the script himself. Bakshi was passionate about Tolkien's work and has stated, "My promise to Tolkien's daughter was to be pure to the book. I wasn't going to say, hey, throw out Gollum and change these 2 characters. My job was to say, this is what the genius said." However, scripting The Lord of the Rings was not an easy process, and many drafts were written. And many scriptwriters were brought in before settling with Peter S. Beagle's script for the movie. My favorite draft of the film that was ultimately cut was written by Chris Conkling and told the bulk of the story in a flashback from Mary Brandybuck's point of view. It would then lead directly into the sequel in real time, and I think that would have been quite an exciting way to bring the 2 films together. This draft also included Tom Bombadil, who even after Peter Jackson's films continues to unfortunately be omitted from any adaptation. Like most of Bakshi's films, rotoscoping was used. This is an animation technique where live-action footage is filmed and then animated over. Publicity for the film announced that Bakshi had created the first movie painting by utilizing an entirely new technique in filmmaking. This new form of animation saved the production costs and gave the animated characters a more realistic look and more realistic movements. Maria Boylan writes that up to that point, animated films had not depicted extensive battle scenes with hundreds of characters. By using the rotoscope, Bakshi could trace highly complex scenes from live-action footage and transform them into animation. Some of the actors who contributed voices to this production also acted out their parts for rotoscoped scenes. The actions of Bilbo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee were performed by Billy Barty. Billy Bard was surprisingly cast as Frodo and shocked many with her performance. The voice actors took primary credit for the portrayal of the designated characters. The legendary John Hurt was cast as Aragorn, William Squire was cast as Gandalf, and Christopher Guard was cast as Frodo Baggins. Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings ultimately comprised the Fellowship of the Ring and the first half of the Two Towers. Critics gave mixed responses to the film, but many considered it to be flawed with a few redeeming qualities. The reviews for the movies were numerous and varied, with many singing Bakshi's praises for his attempt at tackling the impossible film, but many were almost vicious with their hatred for it. Many blamed the experimental animation and despised the ending. Many fans felt that they'd been robbed of a conclusion since the film was titled The Lord of the Rings and believed it would include the complete story. The film could be considered a financial success, however, and it even won a Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, and Bakshi won a Golden Griffin for the film. It was also nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Original Motion Picture Score and for the Saturn Awards for Best Fantasy Film. Currently, The Lord of the Rings is selected as the 36th greatest animated film by Time Out magazine and ranked as the 90th greatest animated film of all time by the Online Film Critics Society. Despite its success, the controversial nature of the film ensured that none of the proposed sequels or Hobbit prequel were ever greenlit, and Ralph Bakshi's story was left unfinished. But this was not the end of the animated Middle-earth movies. After the original airing of The Hobbit on ABC, work on a sequel was greenlit and the development on a sequel began. Production on The Return of the King began under the supervision of Rankin Bass with the original working title of Frodo, The Hobbit 2. The original cast from the previous film returned to reprise the voices of the characters with new actors joining them. Orson Bean returned once again to voice Bilbo Baggins as well as the new lead, Frodo. John Huston also returned as Gandalf, with brother Theodore reprising his role as Gollum. Glenn Warbrough also returned as the principal vocalist, this time credited as the Minstrel of Gondor. And with the return of Glenn, I once again have to mention the phenomenal soundtrack, which may not reach the high quality of the original soundtrack, but still manages to include some phenomenal tracks, like Where There's a Whip, There Is a Way, and Frodo of the Nine Fingers. The animation was once again completed by the Japanese animation company Topcraft. The film followed the basic plot of the novel, The Return of the King. However, due to its compressed runtime, many omissions to the book were made. Some of the most outrageous omissions include the characters of Legolas, Gimli, Arwen, Saruman, Eomer, and Faramir. Even Aragorn doesn't have much dialogue or screen time, despite being the king of the movie's title. Shelob's lair and any mention of the Ents March and Isengard were also omitted from this version of the film. Reception to this TV special has fans divided to this day. Some fans view it favorably as an adaptation that both parents and children can enjoy, while the more critical view it with disdain and loathing, often comparing the film unfavorably to Ralph Bakshi's attempt, which was noticeably darker in theme. Glenn Warborough's songs were widely derided. However, many admit to enjoying Frodo of the Nine Fingers, and especially Where There's a Whip, There's a Way, becoming a cult classic among fans. Director Arthur Rankin Jr. later stated, "We tried to do The Return of the King, but it's an awful lot to put into it. I think Peter Jackson is having the same problem in his films. You can't deviate from these books or somebody will wait on the street for you. In The Return of the King, we had to summarize what had happened before and then put it all together in 2 hours. It's not a very good film." The release of the film was not an easy one either. The release was threatened by a lawsuit filed by the Tolkien Estate and Fantasy Films on the basis that Rankin Bass had not secured the US and Canadian television rights for the book. The lawsuit was settled in a friendly and peaceful manner, allowing it to proceed with the May 1980 release. When asked why he chose to only make The Return of the King instead of making an entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, Rankin admitted, "I didn't know that the audience would sit still for it. I was wrong." And with that, we have discussed a brief history behind the production of the animated Middle-earth movies. And so to answer the questions I brought forward in the introduction of my video. What is the chronological order? This is by far the easiest and most straightforward question to answer. The chronological order of the films actually matches the release of the films. So the story starts with The Hobbit, continues with Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, and concludes with Rankin Bass's The Return of the King. The following 2 questions I will try to answer together as they are a lot more complicated. Are they all canon? And do they tell a congruent and continuous story? In short, yes and no. In the absence of an official sequel to Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King has come to be marketed by Warner Brothers as the final part of a loose animated trilogy preceded by The Hobbit, to which Rankin Bass originally presented The Return of the King as a direct sequel. The 3 films have since been available as a box set for purchase, with all 3 films pushing the narrative that the 3 films were always supposed to be a trilogy. However, this was never the case. Rankin Bass began work on The Return of the King as a direct sequel to The Hobbit before Ralph Bakshi even released his version of The Lord of the Rings. And Ralph Bakshi was aware of the Rankin Bass TV special and was rather open about his dislike of the film and his objections to it. He has been reported as saying, "The Lord of the Rings is not going to have any song for the sake of a record album." This was of course in reference to the soundtrack from The Hobbit. During talks about Ralph Bakshi's prequel to his Lord of the Rings film, Bakshi stated, "They're not going to stop us from doing The Lord of the Rings and they won't stop us from doing The Hobbit. Anyone who saw their version of The Hobbit knows it has nothing to do with the quality and style of our feature. My life isn't going to be altered by what Rankin Bass chooses to do badly." And he later called the film an awful rip-off version of The Hobbit. Saul Zaentz, who produced Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, went as far as to try to stop the production of Rankin Bass's Return of the King from being aired, despite already being storyboarded before Bakshi's film even came out. So it is clear that there is a ton of bad blood between the 2 companies in regard to telling the Lord of the Rings story. To say that there was always a plan to have the 3 films become a complete trilogy is a complete fabrication. And I am pretty sure that Rankin Bass and Ralph Bakshi are quite annoyed that they are often compared to one another, and the fact that they are often grouped together in a collection or called a trilogy must be rather frustrating. To say the films tell a congruent and complete story is also quite far-fetched. With the Ralph Bakshi film being in the center of the two Rankin Bass films, this breaks the unofficial trilogy with its stark difference in animation, storytelling mechanics, and themes. The Rankin Bass films are heavily stylized musicals that lend themselves to a more child-friendly audience, whereas Ralph Bakshi's adaptation is much darker in tone, not shying away from the grittier elements of Tolkien's work. The fact that the three films seem to tell a congruent story is completely coincidental. The similar narrative beats are simply a result of adapting the same book series and nothing to do with a plan to create a multi-movie story. From film to film, narrative plots are also dropped, such as Merry and Pippin with Treebeard. A complete trilogy would not neglect entire story beats like that. The most obvious way to tell that these films were never meant to be a trilogy is the art style and animation. Rankin Bass and Ralph Bakshi have completely different animation styles, and you can see it clearly. You would never be able to guess that these two were supposed to be the same character. So in conclusion, the statement that all three films make up an unofficial trilogy is just a happy coincidence that a marketing team was able to expose and take advantage of. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a little bit more about the animated world of Middle-earth. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and do not be afraid to subscribe. I will see you in the next video. Hey everyone, I just want to take the final 20 seconds out of this video to say thank you so much to Nicole Wickens. She is the artist responsible for these absolutely awesome cartoon characters that you've been seeing throughout this video essay. Nicole, thank you so much. These are freaking awesome. Guys, check her out. Her links are down below.